Now, it's very difficult to do this in a very short presentation, but I thought I'd just give you 3 reasons to be liberal when it comes to moral and religious education. Here's the first argument, and it really just takes the form of a challenge. So see what you think. I tried this in the UK, and people are generally sympathetic, but see what you think. Suppose authoritarian political schools started opening around the country. So in Glasgow, Scotland, a neo-conservative school opens, and then there's a communist school in Edinburgh, and so on.
Communist school?
Yeah, no, it hasn't really happened. I'm just saying it's a thought experiment. Okay, just suppose that this happened. Imagine. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Suppose that these new schools select on the basis of parents' political beliefs. So if you're a conservative, it's going to be pretty hard to get into the communist school. Only the communist parents get their kids in the communist school. And portraits of political leaders beam down from classroom walls, and there are political emblems hanging on the walls. Suppose that each day begins with the singing, collective singing, communal singing of political anthems. You all get together and recite things and sing songs. Suppose that pupils are expected to defer more or less unquestioning to their school's political authority in its revered political texts. Rarely are children exposed to alternative political points of view, except perhaps in a caricatured form, so that they can be sweepingly dismissed. What would be the public's reaction to that? In the UK, people would be absolutely opposed. They would say this is absolutely unacceptable. You know, you cannot have schools like this because you're forcing children's minds into political moulds. These are the kind of schools you find under totalitarian regimes. This is not education, this is indoctrination. Okay? But if you cross out the word political and write religious, you will find hundreds of these schools up and down the country. And many of them are state funded. So the question is, what's the difference? Why, if political schools of this sort are utterly unacceptable, why are religious schools of that sort okay? Indeed, perhaps a jolly good idea. Why is that? Now maybe there's a good answer, but I can't think what it is. Equally unacceptable, actually. I'm not against religious schools, but religious schools like this, no. Not on anymore. They are as unacceptable as their political equivalents.
It may be because of tradition?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's some people call it the anaesthetic of familiarity. You go to sleep because it's always been that way. It's always been that way, so it must be okay. You can become blind and you can't see the actual situation. It's a bit like slavery in the United States 200 years ago. Oh, that's okay. Everyone knows that's okay. It's part of the culture, part of the tradition. A lot of people won't even question it. It's just obvious that that's okay. I think we have a similar situation with faith schools in the UK. People just don't notice that actually these schools are, in many ways, highly oppressive. Remember, I'm not objecting to religious schools, but religious schools of this sort, no, they are unacceptable, I think. So there's one argument, kind of a challenge, which maybe you can meet, I don't know, but see what you think. There's second argument for being liberal. There's growing empirical evidence now that the philosophical approach I was discussing earlier, encourage children to think critically about religious, moral and other big questions, is of educational benefit. You can measure it. It's good for them. So you get a measurable increase in intelligence if you do this, if you run these kind of programs. 6.5% over 1 year, and it was retained after 2 years of no philosophy, which is even more surprising. Whereas the schools in the control group, their intelligence actually went down over the same period. And these are schools were filled with kids, in many cases, that are deprived and not terribly well educated, schools that had severe social problems. In many cases, those problems were reduced. The kids have better social skills, they are more emotionally mature, there is less bullying, and these things are being documented. And the government's body, which looks at schools, is saying, yes, these programs are very effective. So it seems to me this is a good thing. Maybe you should try it out in Romanian schools. Certainly it can be done in religious schools. It's not incompatible with religious education. The third argument for being liberal is this. There are a couple called Pearl and Samuel Olliner who did research into the backgrounds of the people who saved Jews during the Holocaust. And people often say, you often hear it said, that it was religious people saved Jews during the Holocaust. Now, it's true that religion did have a small positive effect. It was slightly more likely to rescue Jews if you were religious than if not. A small effect, but it was fairly negligible. What really marks out rescuers from non-rescuers is that the non-rescuers were brought up in a non-authoritarian way. They were the people that rescued the Jews. The people that had been raised, in a traditional authoritarian way, those were the people that did nothing. Okay. Now the question is, what kind of people do you want to share your society with? In the UK, I mean, I would feel very uncomfortable being surrounded by people who maybe always do the right thing, but they only do the right thing because that's what they've been told to do. And if you tell them to do something else, they'll do that. Seems to me that's a society of moral sheep, and a society of moral sheep is a very dangerous thing. It seems to me that we need to be making sure that children grow up with the intellectual defences in place, immunise them against bullshit and manipulation, political manipulation and bullshit, religious manipulation and bullshit, and that means raising them to be critical thinkers from fairly early on. That needs to be done. It's a safeguard against moral catastrophe, which has happened and inevitably will happen again at some point. So my main conclusion is there are good reasons to be very liberal in our approach to moral and religious education. Let's have schools. In the UK, I'm suggesting we have schools that are very liberal, that encourage children to think and question, maybe philosophy for children programs. That's all compatible with religious schooling. I'm not objecting to religious schools, I'm just objecting to authoritarian schools, whether they be religious or atheist, as in Stalin's Russia. It seems to me that the popular case for a return to traditional religious schooling is largely based on a series of myths and misunderstandings and confusions. And when we get a clearer picture, it is clear that we do not want to be moving back towards authoritarian approaches. That's the end of my presentation. I hope that's had some relevance for you, because obviously I'm coming from a different country and the issues are no doubt somewhat similar. But so any questions?